Have they, I mean, I think on the face of it to me that this is not as good a deal as it has been. Would that be fair? And, well, I mean, I think it's probably pretty obvious if they're doing away with the premium that it's not going to be, it's not as much incentive to put this on your roof as it had been 2 years ago or 5 years ago.
Well, actually, with the, and again, that depends on the particular investment, so that's a very difficult question to answer. However, the program started with a set, fixed credit to every customer for every kilowatt, and it was 15 cents. And so when they changed the program in 2010, they added that because the distributor rates were rising at that particular time to keep up with some of the wholesale rate changes. It actually added a premium on top of that retail rate, so it actually increased the amount, but it lowered the size of the systems that were being installed. So that's where some of the publicity, negative publicity came in, is the size of the system were being decreased. So investors and the large institutional customers out there couldn't participate under this program. And so those credits have decreased quite a bit.
When you say there's a rush to participate, what constitutes a rush?
Having 20 applicants, we've had 39 customers, and having 20 within the last 2 months, we would consider a rush.
Other questions? Okay, we need a motion to pass resolution 1278.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any public comments or any other questions or comments from commissioners? Roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Anderson?
Aye.
Commissioner Canal?
I think I'm going to vote no.
Commissioner Rising?
Aye.
Commissioner Robinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Thompson?
Aye.
Resolution 1278 has passed with one negative vote.
Resolution 1279, amending the debt management policy of KUB.
If you'll recall, last year this board passed a comprehensive debt management policy, and one of the components of that is that staff look at it annually and suggest to you any changes that were necessary. Mark Walker will present those changes that were a result of this year's review.
Commissioner, as Ms. Roach stated, the debt management policy does include a provision that requires an annual review by senior management. That review has been completed. We did identify several changes that we have proposed to be reflected in an amended policy. Those proposed changes were provided to the board's Audit and Finance Committee at their meeting last month. They were discussed with the committee, and after discussion, the committee did approve the change, unanimously adopt a resolution that approved the changes, and also recommended that the full board amend the policy to reflect those changes. So today, I just wanted to take a few moments and review for you the specific changes that are included in the proposed amendment. And the first one has to do with the level of bond issuance premium. The current policy limits or caps the level of the bond issuance premium at 5% of the total bond issued. First of all, you may ask, well, what's a premium? That is when an underwriter bids or purchases the bonds at a value in excess of the face value of the bonds. So the issuer, in KUB's case, gets more than the par value of the bonds in return. And as part of that, the underwriter is giving more money up front in exchange for there being higher coupon rates on the bonds. And that typically happens in a very low interest rate environment, and they're wanting to attract investors to the bond issue itself, so they want the higher coupon rates on the bonds. Now, under current bond market conditions, as you know, interest rates are historically low. So underwriters are consistently bidding and purchasing bonds in the marketplace with premiums well in excess of 5%. In fact, you may recall last March when we sold refunding bonds, each series of those refunding bonds came back with the low-cost bid having a premium in excess of 5%. It ranged actually on the wastewater bonds, I think was the low at 7.5% up to a high of 10.5% on the electric bonds. You may also recall that we went ahead and awarded those bonds to the low-cost bidders. There was provisions in the general resolution that the board adopted that authorized the sale of those bonds that gave CEO authority to award to the low-cost bidders. So we went ahead and pointed to that provision as the ability to award the bonds. But we told the board that day that we wanted to come back and amend the policy to remove that premium or that cap on the premium. And that is one of the proposed changes today, that we take out that 5% cap and include language that authorizes the CEO and the CFO to collectively determine what an appropriate cap level would be, or what an appropriate premium level would be for each bond segment. So it's basically, we're coming back to the board for that, to address that premium issue. that
Why
we
do we have, what's the advantage of having a cap in the first place?
Well, when we first wrote the policy, Commissioner, we in part modeled it after the city policy. And we went back and looked over time to see what premiums had been, and we'd never had one really close to 5%. So we felt, let's go with that. But soon after we adopted the policy, we found out, well, the current market has changed, and with interest rates so low that premiums in excess of 5% are commonplace today, and will continue to be. And whereas for a discount, we have a requirement in the policy for a 3% discount, that's statutory based. There is no statutory basis for a limitation on the premium. So we felt it's prudent to take that off, because current bond market conditions, when we sell bonds here in the next few months, I wouldn't be surprised if we see premiums again in excess of 5%.
When was 5% put in?
When the policy was originally adopted last November. So that's one of the proposed changes. The second change, excuse me, has to do with the management of negative arbitrage. And real quickly, I'll explain that. The IRS allows issuers to refund bonds in advance of the call date on the outstanding bonds. And if you sell those bonds more than 90 days before the call date of the bonds we want to refinance, it's called an advance refund. So what happens is you go ahead and you sell the bonds, you take the proceeds of the refunding bonds, they go into an escrow account, and you invest those in high-grade U.S. Treasury securities, and you earn a rate of interest on that. But the rate of interest that you earn on the escrow account cannot exceed the level of interest on the refunding bonds. If it does, that's what's called positive arbitrage, and that's prohibited by the IRS. But if the rate of interest that you earn is less on the escrow is less than what you have on the refunding bonds, that's called negative arbitrage. And we have a provision in the policy that addresses negative arbitrage. There's nothing wrong with it. You should attempt to try to manage that because it helps your savings in a bond refunding. But the language that when we wrote the policy last year, the language we put in there, I think it could be interpreted to be overly restrictive. And basically it says that KUB shall take all steps to avoid negative arbitrage. And that really wasn't the intent. It wasn't worded as good as it could have been. What we need to have is language that says we'll attempt to manage the level of negative arbitrage, not to avoid it at all costs, because that is just a function of the marketplace and the relationship between short-term and long-term interest rates. And I would say that almost all the deals being done today on advance refundings in the current environment you have negative arbitrage occurring. So basically, we're just changing the language to reflect the original intent of what that provision was. The third change is just a housekeeping matter. Federal regulations have been updated. Our current policy would allow for our financial advisor on a bond deal to resign their post or resign that role and take on the role of underwriter and actually purchase the bonds. And though the current policy provides for that, the federal regulations have been updated in the last year to say that's no longer permissible. So this change is just to take that provision out to reflect the current federal regulations. And the last change that we're proposing is that for the issuance of revenue and bond anticipation notes, that we could use an RFP process. Historically, we've issued a notice of sale and taken in bids based upon that being distributed to local banks. Bond Counsel has advised that going forward, probably the more appropriate process to use is an RFP for that, because oftentimes we might be evaluating the bid on more than just the interest rate. They may include financial covenants or other loan requirements on that, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And in those cases, we need to probably be looking at an RFP as opposed to just issuing a notice of sale. So a very minor change on that. And that's it. Again, to mention to the full board that the audit committee did review that and adopt a resolution at their meeting last week that approved these changes and recommends board approval as well.
Questions?
So is that considered a motion?
We need a motion.
So we went through that in somewhat more depth. They're all, I think they're all changes that need to be made to more reflect the current market conditions.
Second.
Public comment? Other comments? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Anderson?
Aye.
Commissioner Canal?
Aye.
Commissioner Rising? Commissioner Robinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Thompson?
Aye.
All right, resolution 1279 passed.
I would imagine this will be an annual, there'll be a review and probably updates on an annual basis of the policy.
And if there's no changes, we would just report to the audit committee if there are no changes.